sir. Now we're good. Yep. Thank you. Okay. So maybe by the end of Ecclesiastes, I will know how to work all the electronic gizmos. Okay, so to Ecclesiastes, we're going to be looking at chapter 3 this week, so welcome. In case any of you, I guess you guys didn't realize it's National Dress Like Your Preacher Day, so I think I'm the only one that got that memo, but so the rest of you, I hope you feel very embarrassed. Yeah. Yes, Thomas? Yes, it was very painful, thank you. It was a late night and it was a painful night, but there you go. All right, so let's just kind of start off like we have been. Let's just take a quick look at chapter 2 just to kind of get our momentum going here. We'll go through this real quick. So last week we talked about the new things that Solomon was going to start looking at in his journey to find fulfillment, to find meaning in the world. And he tested pleasure, he tested laughter, he tested wine and folly, and we kind of made the comment it was kind of like his period of wine, women, and song. He built projects, he had so many possessions. He talked about his houses, his vineyards, his gardens, his parks, his slaves, his herds, his flocks. We talked about just his wealth was unsurpassed. And we even talked a little bit about just how ornate he furnished his homes and all the stuff that was in there. He looked at silver, gold, treasures. He had men and women singers. He had harems. He basically said, I denied myself nothing at all. And so he's looking at all those. He compared wisdom and foolishness. He came to the conclusion wisdom is better than foolishness, but at the end of the day, the wise man and the fool both meet the same fate. And so is there really an advantage? And then one of his last thoughts was, everything I've done, I'm going to leave to the person who comes after me. And I have no idea what that person will or will do. And with all of my hard work, will that person be wise? Will that person be a fool? And so he comes to the conclusion, man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. And he tells us that that's a gift from God. And so, again, he's been looking at all these different things, looking for meaning and stuff. And he's trying everything. In this latest round of things that he's tried, again, he's not finding satisfaction or that there's anything to be gained in this stuff that he's looking at. And so last week we started a little bit into chapter 3. And we started and we kind of got an intro then, but we'll kind of start there again and get back into it. So in chapter 3, we'll start there. We're going to look at the first 8 verses. There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear down and a time to mend, or not tear down, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And so let's go back and look through some of these. And we started talking last week. This is probably one of the most well-known passages in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we see this in different places. I hadn't thought about this. I don't know if anybody here has seen the movie Footloose, but Tammy reminded me that when they were at the scene where they're trying to convince the town to let them have a senior prom, the young man that's reading from the Bible reads from Ecclesiastes, and specifically the reference, it's a time to dance. And so there was that. We started a little bit last week about, in 1965, there was a pop group called the Byrds that released their hit called Turn, 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 and basically used the words of the first 8 verses almost verbatim. There's just a little bit change in the very last line, but the sentiment was there. And we talked about, what was going on in 1965 in that period of time. Yeah. There was a lot of unrest. And the Vietnam War was going on. We just put troops in Vietnam. People were burning draft cards. Civil rights and social justice issues were big. And people, especially those who were younger people, were looking for meaning and trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. And you remember we made the comment, in some ways, that could apply to several different generations, and perhaps people would say some of the same thing is happening today in the time that we're living in. Now, there's a little bit of trivia on that song, and you have to thank Charles Elk for this, but he let me know that, he said, caught me last week, and he said, the guy that wrote that song is a guy named Pete Seeger, and, he actually was a communist, so isn't it interesting that he would quote from the Bible for the words to a song? I don't know that I knew that, so I had to go look it up, and sure enough, he did describe himself as a communist, although he said, I'm a communist with a small c, whatever that means, and he viewed the song as a protest song, so there's your music trivia. But we look at these 8 verses, and sometimes we refer to these as what's called the catalog of times. And so let's get into them, and let's talk about this concept of time to begin with. So Solomon declares that everything has a time or a season. And then he goes on, he's going to illustrate that assertion with 14 opposing pairs, or what you might call couplets, representing a broad spectrum of possibilities associated with the human experience. So as we look at these from a human perspective, you might say, well, it kind of looks like a positive and a negative thing, constructive and destructive activities are events. When you take them together, they describe an orderly or predictable world, at least in a global sense. These are all things, these happen. This is part of how the world works. These are how things operate. And so just as the created world has a rhythmic pattern built into it, so too our lives in this world experience their own regularities, cadences that ebb and flow with rolling years. So as we get into these things, we'll see these are things that everybody experiences to some degree, in some form or fashion, and it's just part of the rhythm of life. It's part of what happens. So let's dive into those just a little bit deeper. So what is time in this context? He's not talking about time like telling time on the clock. He's not talking about a date on a calendar here when he says there's a time for everything. It's about things are happening, or they should be happening at a particular moment. So it's not so much about time as it is timing. And so if you think about an example, we might have winter clothes and summer clothes. And so we put on our winter clothes not because we hit a magic date. Hey, it's November 5th, everybody must wear winter clothes. We put on our winter clothes because the winter season's weather has arrived. It's cold. We want to wear something warmer. We're going to move to warmer clothes. So it's not about a particular day or time as much as the timing in that case. And that's the same thing he's saying here when there's a time for everything. And so Solomon is noting the common ebb and flow of life. He's not seeking to specify the clock or calendar moments when specific things take place. So that gives us kind of a general idea of where he's coming from. So his first one, a time to be born and a time to die. So this one is pretty universal. I guess you could put a small asterisk, but pretty much everybody is going to be born, everybody's going to die. And these are largely out of our control. No one controls the time they're born, and few, unless it's some kind of tragic circumstances, can control the time of their death. And so, while it's not exact, though, there are things that go along with each of these that kind of let us know we're in that season. We think about conception, incubation, birth, maybe the other end of the spectrum. We think of the process of aging or debilitative illness and death. Those are things a lot of times we can kind of observe the season, if you will. We can observe the process. We just can't predict the exact moments. A time to plant and a time to uproot. So I think most of us probably know in general there's a right time to plant if we want plants to survive and thrive. Excuse me. So if you had gone back Snowmageddon or whatever that was, you know, the big freezes and stuff, if you had said, you know, this is a great time, the landscapers aren't busy, I'm going to have them come in and plant all kinds of new plants and a few trees in my yard, most of us would think, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not the right time to plant. Those plants aren't going to survive. That doesn't make sense. And so we know that. And if we're in agriculture, if we farm or we grow gardens or whatever, we know there's times to plant, seasons to plant where that makes sense. There's also plants that we might consider to be harmful that maybe should be uprooted. And when you look at this, when I first read this, and you're probably the same way, my tendency was to kind of think about when it says kind of the back end of this, it's time to uproot. I'm thinking harvest is kind of my initial thought. You know, there's the time we plant everything, it grows, it's ripe, it's time to harvest. But there's some indication that this is probably more talking more about like tending and cultivating the garden. So if you think about weeding it or removing harmful plants and things from that, maybe you think about the parallel to the parable of the wheat and the tares. So it may not necessarily be about harvest as much as it is about there's the right time to weed and cultivate and remove things that are harmful to the garden or to whatever we've planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. This is probably one of those ones that, you know, on the surface, again, is a little bit harder for us. So this is problematic because, you know, generally we see the sanctity of human life throughout Scripture. And so it's an interesting thing to see him say there's a time to kill and a time to heal. And so one of the things as we look at this, realize Solomon's not necessarily condoning or condemning this. He's just saying this is a fact. This happens. He's not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. He's really kind of neutral. He's just really saying these are the experiences of life. These are the spectrums of things that we go through. He's not telling us what we ought to do. So this is not really a verse talking about something like murder or lawful manslaughter or what happens in wartime or the penalties that maybe happen through the judicial system or things like that. In fact, the Hebrew word that's used here for to kill is not the word used for murder that we see in the Sixth Commandment, for example, thou shalt not murder. So it really just simply acknowledges a common reality in our world. On the flip side of that, when we think about a time to heal, we can think of that as being both literal and figurative, that there's a time to heal physically, there's a time to heal emotionally, there's a time to heal spiritually. A time to tear down and a time to build. So it's probably easier for us in this case to relate to a time to build, or the need to build. You think about some of our cities. I live up north in McKinney, so if you think about what's been going on in Plano and Anna and McKinney and Frisco and those areas, they're growing, and there's need for things. There's need for more roads. There's need for bigger roads. There's need for more facilities and things. And so a lot of times when we think about that, there is a time to build. Businesses expand, populations grow, and that causes a need to build. But the flip side of that, tearing down, can be harder. And it's not as easy to let go of things, to tear down to make room, or to admit, this building, this thing, whatever this is, no longer serves a purpose. And so, we think about maybe different things in life cycles. There's times that relationships need to end. It's time to tear down and to end that. There are times that traditional activities need to be replaced with more relevant ones. Things run their course. They have their purpose, and then it's time to move to something else. But we tend to resist that. And you probably see, you can think of examples all over the place where, something was good for that period of time and it worked, and now it doesn't work as well because things around it, the context, the environment has changed, people have changed, and it's time to tear down and build something new. I'm going to group the next two together because I think they fit together pretty well. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. So if you think about these two, they both relate to the emotional and psychological impact of the affairs of life. You think about the different things we go through. It's kind of difficult to imagine a life without these being a part of it. Yeah, the joys, the sorrows, the mountaintops, the valleys of life, everything that's under the sun are all part of the journey of life. And you notice there's kind of a progression of intensity in these two pairs here. Starts off with weeping and laughing, it moves to mourning and a time to dance. So even within those, the progression, it becomes a little bit more intense. And so for us, learning to react appropriately to these moments is part of the maturation process we go through. Sorrow causes weeping, loss is cause for mourning. And these responses to the difficulties, the different challenges we face in life, these are normal, these are appropriate. We're probably all going to go through it at some point in time. But hopefully life is full of all kinds of moments, each of which deserve the appropriate response. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. Some people suggest that this may be one of the most ambiguous parts of pairing in this whole catalog of time. And they're trying to kind of figure out what this is. There's a lot of people that think it's a reference to the casting of stones in the field of your enemy and clearing a field for agriculture and building a stone fence. And some of those who aren't sure that's what it means, their reasoning, their question is, did this happen often enough in these people's lives that this would be a common occurrence that they could relate to? So that's some of the back and forth on that. It's probably where they're looking at the putting stones in the field is from 2 Kings 3:19. It says, "You will overthrow every fortified city and every major town. You will cut down every good tree, stop up all the springs, and ruin every good field with stones." And so that's a lot of times, that's why I think most people kind of move to that as that's the likely explanation, or that's what they would think of in terms of what he means by casting stones. There's all kinds of other things. Truthfully, as I was looking at and doing some study, some of them were a little far-fetched, it felt like, and so I'm not necessarily going to bring that to mind. But, an interesting observation is the stone is morally neutral, but can be used for multiple purposes. You can use a stone for good, you can use a stone for bad. We can use a stone to build, we can use a stone to injure. The stone in and of itself is neutral. It's how we use it. It reminds us that life is a dynamic proposition. So that's kind of the first half. Let me pause there. Any questions or comments or anything you want to talk about further before we go to the second half? Okay. A time to embrace and a time to refrain. If you looked at maybe a different way we could say this, we might say it as there's a time when an embrace is proper and also a time when wisdom leads one to refrain from embracing. We could probably each think of ideas right now in our heads like that wouldn't be the appropriate response, or that would be a very appropriate response. The little phrase there, time to refrain, is literally to go far from embracing. It might even convey actively removing from the place of embracing. So a lot of these, as we see the pairing and we look at the language, while they're different, there's a lot of them because of the word choice and stuff that are used here. It's like they're kind of on both ends of the spectrum. It's like, there's a time to embrace, there's a time to go far away from embracing. In fact, maybe even get away and remove yourself from that environment. And so he's covering a wide scope or span, if you will, of everything that happens here. You think of times of embrace in both love and friendship. Those things we think of it probably in fellowship when we get together, or when you get together with family, different things when you haven't seen a friend for a long time, those types of things. If this is in the context of relationships, then there are certainly times where we should refrain from an embrace. There may be some seasons that are so calamitous and distressing, and times that are more solemn. where that's just not the appropriate thing. There are times of affirmation where maybe an embrace is the right thing. There's times of confrontation where that would not be the right thing. There's some rabbinical thoughts where they looked at it as some people, good people, you would kiss, you would embrace, you would greet warmly, and other people, those that were wicked, you would keep far away from. And so that was a thought some of the rabbis of the day, how they kind of looked at it, is the embrace and not embrace was more about who the person was, and whether that was somebody you would embrace because of how they lived versus someone you'd stay away from because they were wicked. So the next two, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away. You can look at this and say, okay, this could describe a lot of different situations. It could describe physical situations. It could describe emotional situations. A time to search and a time to give up could also translate as a time to seek and a time to lose. And maybe, depending on what version you're looking at this morning, yours might say a time to lose versus a time to give up. But the idea is there's a point where it makes no sense to keep looking. It's time to stop. At this point, you've done what you can do. It's time to move on. In that first statement, a time to search and a time to give up, you look at that, we don't really have control of that versus the second statement, which is more voluntary on our part. We make the decision of what to keep and what to throw away versus when we're looking for something we don't have or when we have to give up, we can't always control those circumstances. Keeping possessions in perspective is difficult for all of us, but think about what that was like for Solomon. So he's just written in the previous chapter, he's talked about, basically all the possessions, all the things, all the projects he's done. And now he's talking about, there's a time to keep and a time to throw away. Yet he acknowledges he didn't find happiness in them, and they didn't bring him any advantage at the end of life than those who didn't have all the possessions and all those things. We look at the physical world we live in, and it's kind of an easy come, easy go environment. If we place our security in physical things, that's tenuous at best, because the truth is nothing in this world is ours forever. We may have it for a little while, but it's not ours forever. A time to tear and a time to mend. Most people think this probably refers to the process of mourning, or as in tearing of the clothing that was regarded as the appropriate response to grief in this culture in this day. Both in the case of a loved one or when there was a sense of loss associated with sin or heresy. And then the tear was to be mended after an appropriate period of time. So, we've seen this in other places where a loved one has died or somebody has done something so heinous or, so bad that, it causes the grief that people would rent their clothes. You're probably not surprised by this. I read some stuff that said, they even had there was like the ideal length of the tear and different things like that, which I just, sometimes my mind wanders and I try to how do you do that exactly? I blew it. I went 4 inches and it was only supposed to be 3.5. You're just how does that work? I don't know, but they had a lot of strange little things like that. At the same time, there also is times of rebuilding and rejuvenation. So garments that are torn at times of grief are mended during times of healing. And so, like we just referenced, there was a time that you tore the garment. There was a certain period of time that was appropriate to grieve, and after that time had passed, you would typically mend the garment. And all of this, the time to tear, the time to mend, it's all part of a difficult though healthy response to the challenges of life. We don't literally tear, but maybe we emotionally tear. We have different things for the same reasons. Things that disappoint us, things that we just see something that's so evil or so bad, or hits us that way, or of course at the time we lose loved ones or family members or close friends, and those things, we definitely see that. You know, he previously mentioned mourning and weeping in verse 4. So the question is, you know, could this be more symbolic? Would he really repeat something very similar to what he's already said? Or has it got a little bit different take? When he talks about tearing and mending, is it more symbolic? Is he maybe talking about the division of a kingdom or the division of a family or a relationship and the restoration of unity, the healing of a breach? And so again, hard to say. As you go through these, there's some ways to interpret them where they seem very similar to some of the ones we just talked about. And most of the thought is, I'm not sure that would make sense, because why would he say the same thing essentially twice? But, you know, that's left to us to kind of figure out. Anyone have any other thoughts just on that, if you think this is more literal or symbolic? I'm going to cold call Kevin because I know he reads a lot of this. Have you seen any other thoughts, different thoughts than those?
No, I think there's a lot of different now, right?
Yeah.
There's sort of an overall message here that it's always trying to get across.
Yep. There you go. Good point. All right, we'll keep moving here. A time to be silent and a time to speak. You know, a lot of these, as you look at them, they feel like they're connected to the one we've just read, and that they kind of flow to each other. And so if we connect this to the previous one, a time to tear and a time to mend, and we think about the process of mourning, you know, it was common to have a period of silence on the part of those who shared in this period of grief. So is it tied to that? Perhaps. I think you'd agree the applications are, oh, sorry. Yep. Yep. I think it's definitely very feasible, and it's certainly an application for sure. I don't think anybody could argue with that. No, thank you. Thanks for the heads up over here. So if we think about the tie there, it could be that, but I think there's broader applications even than just if you tie it to mourning. Times we speak when we should be silent. Times we're silent, we should speak. You know, that the trick is figuring out, you know, which is which. You know, when.
People in Bible class tend to follow this fairly closely.
Yep. Loving the humor for sure.
Silent, you know, when you speak, you know, you might make things worse. Like Proverbs, I believe it says that when there's no wood, fire will go out. Or there's no action or whatever.
Right.
You know, the more you add to the wood, you know, the fire gets bigger. So, you know, sometimes it's best to be silent. Let things die down as we speak. Cause great chaos like cancer. You know, it can make things worse, make it spread.
Yeah. Very true. As you're saying that, I'm thinking about marriage. It's kind of the same way. There's some wisdom in knowing that there's time to be silent. Sometimes we learn the hard way. Hey, Chris.
Proverbs talks about a quiet answer turns away wrath, and I've tried this on bosses who were mad at me, and they were angry and screaming, and I would purposely, in a calm, low voice, where they had to listen to me and hear what I say, and it's amazing how quickly
All good points. Do you find,
React and you get a react.
very,
How you approach the way
Yeah.
is what do we know will be?
very true. You wish sometimes you were like the Secret Service and you had one of those little things in your ear, could kind of say, hey, you should probably shut up, or no, somebody needs to speak up, say something. There he is.
It's like tailbearers, tailbearers like tattletales, when they go around spreading gossip and everything, that makes things worse too.
Yep. There's definitely information we come across that's better just kept with ourselves, that doesn't need to be said.
It says when you get rid of the tailbearer, strife cease.
Yeah, all good comments for sure. Good comments. You know, we see examples throughout Scripture too, especially in the Old Testament, where there's different things where, you know, speaking up, Esther speaking up for her people that we read about. Some of you have referenced Proverbs 21, guard your words, mind what you say, and you will keep yourself out of trouble. You know, James talks a lot about the power of the tongue and its ability. You know, man's able to tame everything except for the tongue. You think about Peter denying Jesus. You think about Jesus standing silent before Pilate. So those things. Go ahead.
I actually think about Nathan when he had to confront David and how hard that must have been, and thinking about a time to be silent or a time to speak, a time to tear and a time to mend. How angry David must have been with him, but knowing that it was a time to speak. So in our own lives, when we see sin or when we have a friend who maybe needs to be confronted, it's like, well, I don't want to destroy that friendship, so maybe I shouldn't say anything. But like knowing how to speak in love. That's what.
Yeah, good. Lots of good examples. Okay. So we've talked about, you know, definitely all kinds of situations where it does make sense for it to speak up, and you guys have covered most of my other points, so we'll move on. A time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So a time to love and a time to hate, we might look at that more as that's interpersonal, that's within ourselves. The second one maybe is more socio-political, one's more private, one's more public, a difference in scope, if you will. But in both cases, there's an acknowledgement that these realities exist even at times when they shouldn't. It doesn't advocate these emotions, it simply describes them as part of the full spectrum of the human experience. In Hebrew, the word for love there is ahab, which is to have affection for, to have strong emotional attachment to, and desire to either to possess or to be in the presence of the subject. It can be the love that men and women have for each other. It can be the love between parents and children. It was used in the description of Jonathan and David. It can be fixed on an object, a circumstance, an action, or a relationship. And conversely, the Hebrew word there for hate is sane, and that represents an emotion that can range from intense hatred to the much weaker set against. And so it's used in relation to persons, things, ideas, words, inanimate objects. So again, the idea is showing such a strong contrast between the two, between the love and the hate. You know, we certainly know that God hates things and says that his people should hate those kind of things too. You know, Amos 5, hate evil, love good. Deuteronomy 7, God says that he hates idolatry. Deuteronomy 12, God says he hated the ways in which the Canaanites worshiped their gods, and he used the example of child sacrifice as the reason he hated that. On the flip side, we think about love being so characteristic of God, and it's said to be his nature. And so we see those things. We see those things even in God. There are many times where tyranny leads to war. So do circumstances and context determine if a given action is good or bad. War was a part of the life of God's people in the Old Testament. Sometimes God even used it as a tool, if you will, to accomplish his purposes. At the same time, unjust violence is condemned frequently in Scripture and shouldn't be characteristic of the people of God. And so he says a time for peace. Peace is the proper end to war there. And so you look at those things, and it's funny sometimes how these things become more relevant because we're certainly in a situation, and please, I'm not trying to get off on a discussion about war, but, we're living in a situation right now where there's a war going on, and, for most of us and the rest of the world looking at that, we do feel like that's very unjust, and it's not proper, and, we're talking about our war crimes being committed and different things like that. So we see an example right in our headlines today. It's happening right in front of us. So that's the end of the catalog of times. Any last comments or questions before we keep moving on? Okay. What does the worker gain from his toil? I've seen the burden God has laid on men. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from the beginning to end. I know there's nothing better for men than to be happy and do good while they live, that every man may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. So he starts off asking the question, what does the worker gain from his toil? And we've actually seen him ask pretty much the same question in chapter 1, verse 3. And so he's asking again. And he doesn't necessarily seem to be introducing new material as much as kind of reflecting on everything that he's just kind of said and that he's kind of gone through. He just laid out what we call the catalog of times in the first 8 verses, where his point has been that the contradictory events of human life, both good and bad, are beyond man's control. At one moment, he will be called upon to laugh, at another to weep, but he can scarcely hope to derive any gain from this alternating pattern not determined by him. So the reality is that the pattern order in the world doesn't lead us to find gain in all of it. The rhythms rumble through our lives. We find them happening to us often without awareness of what's really going on. And the very fact that life keeps changing leaves us with no lasting success or feeling of deep satisfaction. And so again, we keep talking about he's given us the filter of under the sun to kind of let us know he's looking at us strictly from an earthly perspective, from a human perspective. He's not considering the role of God in all of this. And so he's gone through so many things these last chapters, all these different experiences, all these different things he's tried, and he still keeps coming to the same conclusion. It's like, I'm not finding an advantage of one over the other when it comes to when your life ends. I don't know that I see the advantage. I'm not finding meaning. I'm not finding happiness in these things. And so that's kind of where he's at this point. He comes from a unique perspective because his personal experience was very comprehensive, and he shared the details of his life with us in the first 2 chapters. And when he says, I've seen the burden that God has laid on men, he has credibility in that statement. He has seen everything. He's got the view from the top. He's the king. He sees everything that goes on. He sees the things that are going on with Israel right now and going on in his kingdom. So his view is somewhat unique. He's seen how each generation finds itself engaged in the same activities, and it's a task that has occupied men in each generation. And as we've gone through this, he keeps talking about this. It's like, generations come and go, but these things are still here. These things still happen. We looked at some things ourselves here. It's like, okay, that almost sounds like we could have written that today because of the same principle. He was talking about it then, but it's still going on today. We're still dealing with that. Verse 11, God has made everything beautiful in its time. You may remember a Ray Stevens song from 1970 with the lyric, everything is beautiful in its own way. So more music trivia today. This will be the Sunday of music trivia. Essentially saying God has made everything appropriate in its time. And he just laid out the same thought in the first 8 verses. There's a time for everything. There's an appropriate time for that. There's a season for these things and these experiences. God is eternal, man is not, but we can experience all the different times of our lives, knowing that they're part of a bigger picture we cannot see, but is visible to God, who sees the whole as beautiful. And so, the idea of we're limited in what we can see. Our scope, our view of things is very narrow. And so a lot of times the stuff that we're seeing, we don't understand, and it doesn't necessarily make sense, or we don't understand the timing of things. But saying from God's viewpoint, it's all beautiful. The way that everything fits together, the way it all works. because he can see the outcomes. He can see the whole thing. He can see things. He knows where things are going that we don't know, that we have no way of knowing. We are right up against the end, so rather than start there, we're going to come, when we come back next week, we'll start with He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, and that's where we will take off from. So we're in our last minute. Any last comments or anything anybody wants to say before we wrap up? Yes.
What we all should do is just be content with what we have, not try to gain more. So what's it about man to gain the whole world, loses soul?
Yeah.
Just be content with what we have.
He's actually working to a very similar statement here at the end of chapter 3 that we'll see. So there was your teaser for next week. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your comments, your feedback, and we'll see you again next week.